Well, hello, everyone. My name is Anna Truxas, and I am the executive director of the Portland Chinatown Museum. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the fifth presentation in our six-part series, Hidden Histories. It's the series on Chinese American history in Oregon. And I have to say, this is also our second round of it. We're so lucky to be working with OCDP on this another round. Before we get started, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. The Portland Chinatown Museum acknowledges and honors the indigenous peoples and their descendants of the Lower Columbia and Willamette River region, whose lands the City of Portland and our museum currently occupy. These include Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Witlala Chinook tribes, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, who today are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, and the many other Chinookan peoples who established communities along the Lower Columbia, whose descendants today are members of the Grand Ronde, Warm Springs, and Siletz Confederated Tribes of Oregon. And now just a bit about today's presentation. Hidden Histories was made possible in part with the generous support and partnership of the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project and the Oregon Parks and Rec Department Heritage Grant. The OCDP is an award-winning grassroots local, state, federal partnership that was conceived and initiated in underserved rural communities in southern and eastern Oregon. So glad to be in that region with our topic today. The research generated through these public archaeology projects is helping to update and center the history of the Chinese diaspora and Chinese Oregonians in the development of the state. Today's presentation comes from guests Linda Lung and Catherine Dickson, and will introduce the history of Auburn's Chinese community and the journey of the Lung family. And they both have lengthy bios, but in the interest of preserving time for their presentation, we're going to ask that you reference the bio on our website. And just a few notes before continuing. We have turned on closed captions and we are taking questions at the end. You can add your questions and comments to the chat or the Q&A, and we will watch for those and make sure the presenters see them. So without further ado, welcome, Catherine and Linda. We're thrilled to have you here today.
Thank you very much. And hopefully I've properly shared my screen. So yeah, thank you for having me. And I'm going to start today by talking about a common story in the West, a boom town. Like so many such towns, it started with gold. And like many gold mining towns in the West, Chinese miners were key to its history. Gold was discovered in eastern Oregon in 1861 near Baker City. The miners established the Blue Canyon Mining District. Today, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife manages a wildlife area within that mining district. In 2024, ODFW hired Southern Oregon University Laboratory of Anthropology and Hoyo to document archaeological sites in detail. Here's a close-up of the project area, and I'll point out some of the places that I'll be referencing. First, we have what was the town of Auburn. It's located along Blue Canyon, for which the mining district was named. You'll notice both of those are just outside of our project area. Poker Gulch is an area that was mined inside the project area. We found a total of 5 habitation sites that were definitely associated with Chinese miners, all along Poker Gulch. Now we'll look at maps over time. The map on the right from 1864 shows Auburn in its prime. You can see the town with its gridded streets is just outside of the project area. Poker Gulch is where these gold mines are marked. You can see people are claiming property to the east. By 1901, the date of the map on the left, most of the houses in Auburn were along the Blue Canyon Road. By this time, there's also a road along Poker Gulch, where the road is today. This structure appears to be one of the Chinese sites that we found. Now that we've oriented ourselves, what was Auburn like? It grew like crazy, and then the population crashed. The peak was about 5,000 people in 1862. By 1870, the population had fallen by more than 90%. The census data show the flip from majority Chinese people in 1870 and 1880 to majority white people in 1900. And just as a note, the 1890 census was almost completely destroyed in a fire in Washington, D.C. The censuses we do have show a very small number of Chinese women. The majority of men in all 3 decades were minors. In 1870, 70% of the minors were Chinese. Other professions for Chinese residents were trader, doctor, washerwoman, cook, and domestic servant. In 1880, about 75% of the minors were Chinese. Other professions for Chinese residents were 2 teamsters and 1 shopkeeper. And as a spoiler alert, the shopkeeper was Linda's great-grandfather. As you'll recall, gold was discovered here in 1861. By 1863, people were already moving on to other gold discoveries, partly because of the shortage of water in the Auburn area. Extensive ditch networks were developed, but the water was too expensive to support the amount of gold placer mining was yielding. Eventually, in 1867, the ditch company prepared to sell water to Chinese miners. If they sold more water, they could reduce water rates for everyone. As noted in the previous slide, by 1870, the majority of the miners were Chinese. The first reference to a Chinese mining claim in the district was in 1867. In 1869, Ah Sam bought a claim in Poker Gulch. Further claims by Chinese miners in Poker Gulch were not located, but we know they were mining in the area until at least 1900. The figure on the right shows the mining system within the project area. The Chinese archaeological sites were located along these mined areas. You can see the ditches and water management systems bringing water to the mining complexes. These were originally used by white miners, but were improved and maintained by Chinese miners. Later, they became irrigation systems for homesteaders. As I noted, we found 5 Chinese habitation sites. 4 of them had the remains of structures of some sort. 2 are semi-subterranean. This one has an alignment of rocks that may have been part of a foundation. And this one is the remains of a log cabin. Other features are these piles of rocks identified at 3 of the sites. These are understood to be stove features. At their simplest, the stoves may have looked like this, a reconstruction built by archaeologists with the Malheur National Forest. People would build a relatively small fire and put a wok on top. Excavations in other areas have suggested that stove features may have been integrated into structures so that the incidental heat could provide warmth inside. The stoves may also have served to help dry clothing. These are some of the artifacts we found. Some tell us for sure that these are Chinese sites, such as this bamboo pattern bowl, this can that likely contained tea, these fragments of an opium pipe bowl, and this handmade and seriously abused axe head. The other artifacts are simply interesting. A calico button, a cache of metal, perhaps to make things like the axe head, a possibly homemade shaker top, and a magnifying lens. We were all really excited to find these artifacts on site that suggest there were children, a marble and 2 fragments of a porcelain doll's head. Our findings were consistent with what the research told us. There were a lot of Chinese miners in the area. We hope to protect these sites until such a time as more work or excavation can take place so we can learn more about these important people in our past. As noted above, we did quite a bit of research with the census records. Unfortunately, the data the government gathered about Chinese residents is poor. Almost everyone is listed with the name Ah. Usually I try to learn about the individual people who created the archaeological sites I find. The rampant errors about Chinese people in the census is just one of the many forms of erasure targeting Chinese immigrants and is generally effective in preventing us learning more about the people. But when I saw this census entry with Chinese American children born in the United States, I thought perhaps I could trace them. And through Ancestry.com, I did. I traced the family through generations and across the West straight to Linda Lung. We can't definitively say that her family spent time at the Chinese sites we recorded, but we can say they lived within a quarter mile. Did the toys we found belong to the Lung children? They certainly might have. Linda will now take over and share her family's history.
Thanks, Catherine. Next slide. Again, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Lung family history, how we went to Denver, Chinatown, what was Chinatown like, and again, our story, again, the struggles that the family faced, and then how the family persevered. When you think of the Lung family, there's 7 generations. I'm the 4th generation. We've been in the United States for over 150 years and in Denver for 100 years. To understand some of the Chinese timeline, you can start seeing in 1871 where there were massacres. There was a riot in San Francisco. There's Hell's Canyon, the Rock Springs, and then we also had the Denver anti-Chinese riot. Then there was the Exclusion Act, and then the San Francisco earthquake, and then the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act and how it relates to our family. So this is Sam Lung. Again, he had different names. He was born in 1852 in China, and he died in Pocatello, Idaho in 1916. He was a merchant, a miner, but he was also a gambler. And this is our matriarch. This is Amoy. She was born in Auburn, Oregon in 1871, and she died in Denver, Colorado in 1962 at 91 years old. This is a photo of her when she was young, and this is her story that I'm going to tell. This is her birth certificate. Again, when I first got the birth certificate, I kept going, where's 12 miles west of Baker City? And that is Auburn. Again, this is Amoy. She was the first born. Her father is Kim Gun Sin, and her mother is Susie Jin. But again, what's interesting is the age of the parents. He's 48 years old and she's 38. He's a minor. And again, you'll see the names of David Littlefield and also Catherine Griffith. And Henry Griffin was a minor with David Littlefield, and they become important in our life later on in Auburn. This is also the Oregon Register. So it shows Amoy, but it also lists her kids. Geo is George. There's Charlie. There's Pearl. It's when they were born. They were all born in Auburn. And the back page, which is the next slide, shows again who their parents were. So the first page was Kim. This is Susie. And then, of course, Amoy and Sam Lung. The people that were important on that document was David Littlefield. And again, on the balcony in his house in Auburn, you'll see that Miss Littlefield, Oliver Holloway, their son David, Eva Littlefield Holloway, Myrtle is holding the horse, and Grace is now Mrs. W.D. Holloway. In Amoy's files, and again, this was in a folder, we found a handwritten note that has all of these different people's names. So Maud Alexander is the granddaughter of David Littlefield. Grace Littlefield now married W.D. Holloway. Eva married Oliver Holloway. And then you'll see a man that's listed on the bottom as Peter Bassey. And again, he's important because he's in the courthouse and he's a judge. So here's Amoy and her parents, Kim Gun Sin and Susie Jin. There's a newspaper article that came out, and it said that 14-year-old Amoy was won in a gambling bet between her father and Sam Lung. And again, this is a story that we've heard through our family, and Amoy did not ever dispute it, but whatever the reason was, is that she became Sam Lung's wife. But also in the meantime, you have to understand that when she was 14, her dad was 61 and her mother was 51. So in fact, was she just sold to Sam Lung, or did he actually win her in a gambling bet? So they were married. September 2nd, 1886, and they're married at the house of Mrs. Thomas Smith, and Thomas Smith is the Justice of the Peace. So Catherine already alluded to this, but I wanted to share one story, is that when they were in Auburn, Amoy would say that everyone thought that she was going to do laundry. And Amoy told my father she never did laundry. But what she would do is she would actually take a brush and she would brush off the clothes of all of the miners, and she ended up getting a good amount of gold dust. Next slide. Yes. So Amoy and Sam's children, if you look from left to right, there's Pearl. That's their daughter. She was born in 1891. Then there's George in 1886 and Charlie in 1888. And both the boys have Qs. So George was born in 1886. Again, they were married after George was born. So he died in 1945 in Denver, Colorado at 59. But as you can see from his birth certificate, Sam was 49, Amoy was 14. And again, for all of theirs, and it's even current now in that when we were Denver, for some of our parents' birth certificates, they're listed as yellow. Charlie Lung is the next one. It's not 1887, it's actually 1888. And again, he died in 1969 at 82 years old. And Pearl is the baby. She was born in 1891 and she died in 1960 at 69 years old. Again, he was 55 and Amoy's 20. I was able to find Susie Jin's birth in 1833, and she died in Auburn at 62 years old. I could find no record of Kim Gun Sin. So during all this time is the immigration legislation. The first one was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Again, this was a federal law signed by our president, Chester Arthur, of 1882, and it prohibited all immigration of Chinese laborers for 10 years. So the law made exceptions for students, merchants, and professionals. But the act also denied Chinese residents already in the U.S. the ability to become citizens. This was the first time the American government restricted immigration on the basis of race and national origin. And the Geary Act of 1892 extended the exclusionary restrictions for another 10 years, but it required every resident Chinese laborer in the U.S. to register for and carry a certificate of residence. But what's more important is it required a white individual to serve as a witness for the Chinese person because, as we all know, whites were considered much more credible. So the Auburn map. Again, this is a pretty rough map. It's from 1936, and W.S. Hughes drew this map where he was sitting on the side hill above Poverty Flats, looking across the canyon. But it kind of gives you an idea of where we think Sam Lung's store, again, Thomas Smith's house where they got married, and then where David Littlefield's house was. For the family, we always thought that Sam Lung, he would tell us it was the three dragons. When you think in Chinese, Sam Lung is the words for three dragons. The Uncle Dave Discovers Gold book was written by Maud Alexander. And again, one of the things that she said is that one of the businesses that was owned by the Tong was leased to Sam Lung, who was also known as Sam Lung. The house in which they lived consisted of living quarters in the back and a large room for merchandise in front. It was stocked with commodities, much like the store across the street, but with more of an American atmosphere than Chinese. Upstairs over the store was a room with an outside entrance and stairs. There was a joss house or church used daily by all Chinese. It was kept plentifully supplied with incense sticks, which were used to provide the smoke on which the prayers ascended to heaven. So this is the daily sales. This is a ledger that was found in one of the old buildings that was actually at the site. And it just gives you an idea of what they were actually in 1868 buying. And from looking at some of the findings that Catherine has found, maybe these are some of the tins and the buttons. Again, a 75-pound sack of rice was $7.50 in 1868, and a pound of tea was $1.25. For some of the canned goods, there were peaches, 75 cents a can, which is a lot of money back then. Bamboo shoots, there was tomatoes, there was oysters in a can, and some mashed shrimp for 35 cents a can. So you can kind of get an idea of what they were eating and how much it cost. But the miscellaneous, you could get firecrackers, and everyone needs some firecrackers, but there must be special orders because you could get a violin string for 38 cents. And of course, Catherine found a pipe, and the pipe, at least they had 2 boxes of opium. I hope these are large boxes of opium for $69. And again, brandy, tobacco, whiskey, and of course our toothpaste and bar of soap. But the fabrics that they could have is that 12 yards for a calico for $2. But the interesting one was 14 yards of gray doe skin and also alpaca. But there's buttons, spools of threads, and of course clothes that they could get. So again, they could get shoes, baby shoes, hose, and white shirts and collars, and a corset, and boots, and a coat. So again, in another book by Gold Dust and Chalk Dust that was written by Dr. James R. Evans, again, Auburn was the first school district in Eastern Oregon. It was established late in 1862. The first building was built of logs. The Auburn district was abandoned and annexed to District 21 in 1940. There's no record of what happened to the schoolhouse, but residents believe it was salvaged for the lumber. But part of the old stump and foundation still stand, and I'm hoping Catherine's going to find it. So here is the Baker School, the Auburn School District #1. So you can look at the back row, and the third one in is Charlie Lung. So there's my grandfather, and here are some of his classmates. What I found interesting is that the Alexanders were there. So Melvin and Maud, the one that wrote the book, actually became school teachers later on. But the Abel group, all the kids that are from the Abel family, actually Sam Lung's house is very close in Auburn on the Abel land. So Catherine showed you the 19 census in Auburn, but at the same time, the 1900 census in Baker City, you can actually see Sam Lung. So he's there with Amoy, there's Sing, which is George, Charlie, Pearl, but they also have boarders, 3 boarders, and then there's a cook. What's interesting about this is that Amoy has indicated that she is born in China, which is incorrect. She was born in Oregon. But if you look at this, they're living between 2 white families. So there is the Kennedys, George Kennedy, and on the other side is Thomas Jones. And I could not find where they ever actually lived in Chinatown, except for one document. Next. So this is a map of Chinatown. It's the shaded area. It's over there. It's by Auburn and Resort. And that's where also the Spring Garden was. And then off to the side over by the highway is the Chinese cemetery. So Charlie, in 1915, he has a certificate of identity, and it lists his occupation as a student. His age is 27 years old, and it's 165 Resort Street in Baker City, Oregon. And again, I've looked at some of the Sanborn maps, and I am not able to really find where this 165 Resort Street is. But this is the only time that I see that they were ever living in that Chinatown area. The Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, again, I just wanted to give a shout out to. My son and I actually went to Portland, Oregon, where I presented with Catherine at the Society for Applied Anthropology. On the way back, we came to the Chinese cemetery. Again, it's pretty interesting to have a pioneer cemetery where they have some of the remains of the people, but most of them were actually sent back to China. What was more amazing to us is that Baker City Historic Museum has a permanent Chinese exhibit. So again, to shout out to Baker City, Oregon, because Denver doesn't even have one. We have temporary ones. Again, for the 1900, the Sumter Miner, these are the county records. And it shows that Sam Lung, again, was working with Peter Bassey. And there's 600 feet of 6-inch mining pipe. For one day, it was $78. And the 1800 Main Street, the Bosch and Company, the Bassey Company is still there. So in the Gold, Jade, and Elegance book that was written by Helen Rand, there's financial success. Sam Lung is listed as one of the Chinese that deposited gold and received payment from the original First National Bank of Baker. Again, this is the inside and outside of the bank. And second from the left is J.H. Parker. He's the vice president of the bank. So again, you already saw this when I first showed you the certificate of birth, but let's take a look at the back. So on August 19th, 1910, Amoy and her children's birth certificates are certified to show that all of them were born in Auburn, Oregon. And this is going to be important later on. So again, why did the Lungs move? Again, we can assume that it's racism discrimination. 1918, the Miller's Restaurant at 1913 Court, the southwest corner of First and Court, is operated by Dorothea Miller and her children. And below the word restaurant are the words all white, indicating no Chinese or Negro employees. But I think one of the most significant ones is the Rainbow Vigilance Corps. Even though it has a cute name of Rainbow, again, the purpose was to keep the Chinese miners out of Mormon Basin. In 1903, there was a federal investigation at the request of the Chinese government. There was an incident where the whites attacked a Chinese camp at Mormon Basin, injuring some of the Chinese and setting fire to the buildings and stealing. So again, what just happened was Hell's Canyon. They've also seen Rock Springs Massacre. So this is probably a good time for the Chinese to start moving, especially the Lungs. So the Lungs moved to Pocatello, Idaho. They lived and owned a house at 333 Fifth Avenue. And again, if you look at their clothes, they're certainly starting to look a little bit more American. So the Lungs' journey to Denver, it is a scattershot. We can start finding some of the Lungs in Rock Springs, Wyoming. They're in Denver. They're in Pocatello, Idaho. Even in the 1940s, Amoy kept a residence and she rented out a house in Pocatello, Idaho, and then they start moving into Denver. But they are all over the map and where they're trying to go in. It's like they're sending out scouting teams to see if it's a good, safe neighborhood. So the first one, Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1908. In May 1908, Pearl, who's age 18, marries Leo Binghua, who's 36, and Amoy Lung is the witness for their marriage record. So we even found a postcard. It says, "To my dear hubby, Louie, from your wifey, Pearl." So on September 1st, 2025, there was a 140th anniversary of the 1885 Chinese massacre. Again, this was the Rock Springs Massacre. And as you can see from a lot of the names, they are Leo. Again, they have a wonderful statue that they've made, and it's on the edge of Chinatown in Rock Springs. But one of the posters that they had, and a friend went up there to the actual anniversary, it shows that there are 5 Chinese residents of Rock Springs within this time frame, and there's Leo Binghua. Only the picture that they have there is not Pearl, and Pearl and him never had any kids. So through connections, through the buried Chinatown, their marriage did not last. Leo returned to China to find a young woman to marry and bring back to Rock Springs. And Yep Toi Hung and Leo had 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls. He moved to Omaha, Nebraska, Chinatown, where he raised his family, and Leo never mentioned his second wife to Pearl in his immigration interview. So again, the two families, again, I talked with some of Leo's family, his grandkids. We assumed that Pearl was a native-born woman, was visiting Charlie, her brother, became infatuated with Leo and got married. Once he found out that she was pretty opinionated and outspoken, he chose to end the marriage, and Pearl returned to Pocatello, Idaho. So Charlie is in, this is his World War I registration form. He's at 203 North Front, which is across the street from the Union Pacific Railroad Depot. Again, you can see that he is working as a waiter in a restaurant, and he's working for one of the Leos. So he's actually working at the Mandarin Cafe. Excuse me, he's at the Shanghai restaurant. My mistake. So again, he's at the Shanghai restaurant in Rock Springs, Wyoming. So 1911, Charlie and George Lung have marriages. So here is the important document, because those are the Baker City men that actually signed an affidavit. So we have Peter Bassey, we have J.H. Parker, who's the banker, we have Fred Cole, who was a clerk, and then we have the Littlefields. And they vow that they have personally known Charlie. He attended Baker City schools. They're personally acquainted with his father and mother. He resided in Oregon until 2 years ago when he was in Rock Springs, and he tends to visit China and permit him to depart and return because he is a native-born citizen. So again, this was September 19th, 1910, and she had just gotten the birth certificate certified in August 1910. So again, Charlie went to China in December 1910 to find a wife. And again, what we've been told from people who do the genealogy is that they just don't randomly go to China. They usually go to the village where their father was born. So again, in 1911, Charlie married Qin Shi Ying. We called her Lucille in Tamsui, China, when she was 16 years old. He stayed in China for 3 years, and Lucille gives birth to Mabel, his first daughter, December 12th, 1912, and that's a picture of Lucille's dad. But Sam Lung dies in 1960 at age 60, but he's listed himself as single, which I thought was interesting. But in the 1917 Pocatello, Idaho directory, it not only lists that Sam Lung is dead, but it also shows that we still have Amoy and Charlie and George and Pearl are still in the Pocatello area. So Charlie is going to go back to China. In the 1970 passport application, the purpose, though, he writes, is to see his father and bring his wife and child back to the United States. So Sam Lung died in 1916. So was Charlie taking his body and ashes back to China? And in the meantime, Lucille has given birth to Eugene on September 19th, 1919. So the letter of support from Amoy, she states that her son, Charlie, lives in Rock Springs and has only been out of the country from December 19th, 1910 to September 1913 for a visit to China. So again, he's going back again, the final time, to his passport application is in 1921. The purpose is Charlie is going to China to bring his wife and family to the United States. And in the meantime, Lucille is given birth to Harry on July 12th, 1921. So when they get there to China, Charlie has 2 wives in China. Amoy could only afford passage for one. So this family story is that she selected Lucille, who had more attractive children. So again, as you look from left to right, Eugene's got his hand on Charlie's knee. And then we have Harry, who Charlie is holding. There's Mabel, and then there's Lucille. The woman that's on the left she is left behind with the son. So Charlie and Qin Shi Ying, Lucille, arrived in the United States in November 1921. So again, he went back, he got the kids. So if you look from right to left, you have Clarence, Hattie, Rose, there's Pearl, his sister, there's Charlie, there's Lucille, there's Mabel, There's Eugene, and Amoy is holding Harry. Again, their clothes look very different from what they looked like back in China. But George Lung is going to get married. He's marrying Lillian Pfeiffer. She's the tall woman that's in back in Denver on October 17th, 1911. Interracial marriages between whites and blacks, Indians and Chinese were illegal in Idaho. They had very specific laws. So again, they had to come to Denver to get married. They had 3 children. They were all born in Pocatello, Idaho. So Amoy is the little girl that's got the doll in her hand. Hattie is the baby that Amoy is holding, and Clarence is not in the picture. But Lillian got a divorce and took Amoy, who looked more white, and left Hattie and Clarence to be raised by Amoy. But when you look at the marriage records, George and Lillian are listed as white. And again, they didn't even put their ages, and it's probably good because Lillian was 12 when they got married. But on November 12th, 1913, it says in the newspaper that a marriage license was issued. And again, it's Hong Wing, an Americanized Chinaman of Pocatello, and Pearl Lung, a Chinese woman of Baker City, Oregon. So again, Pearl is 22 years old and Hong is 45 years old. And again, they have just done a marriage license. And in the directory, Hong Wing lives at 355 South Fifth Avenue, and Amoy and her family lives at 333 South Fifth Avenue, which is very convenient to be down the street. So now they're going to arrive in Denver. When they arrived in Denver, again, Denver's Chinatown, there's ethnic groups that were redlined, there were boundaries and defined where they could live. The Lungs lived in Chinatown. It was called Hop Alley and in the Five Points area. The reason why it was called Hop Alley, that was the whites, how they would describe Chinatown, because they said the Chinese were all hopped up on opium. So all the kids went to Whittier Elementary, Cole Middle School, and Manual Training Center. The Chinatown Directory, again, this is a 1913 Chinatown Directory where it was actually published in China, where it was kind of the green book of the Chinese, where they would know where to go once they got into the United States, into any of these towns. So again, Chinatown provided the goods and services and food the Chinese wanted and were accustomed to. There was also a sense of safety and a feeling of belonging because the Chinese looked different. They had different clothes, customs, religion, and food, but the whites would come to Chinatown because it was exotic and mysterious. There was opium, gambling, prostitution, of course, good food, and the visitors also enjoyed the fireworks of the Lunar New Year. And the opium that the people were smoking, again, was usually the white people that came down to smoke. But one of the messages that Amoy gave all of us is become Americans, dress like Americans, fit in, don't draw attention, and don't make waves. You can see from looking at Hattie and Clarence, they're looking like pretty regular kids, Americanized kids. So religion. Amoy was the moral compass for the family, and everyone attended 23rd Avenue Presbyterian Church. Again, all the children were enrolled in the Cradle Roll Bible School. That's my dad's certificate that's in the picture. The family participated in fundraising church activities. They sang songs in Chinese that benefited the China Relief Fund. Amoy had a wonderful relationship with Mary Van Deren, a Scottish missionary who guided her spiritually. And the Lung family adopted religious events, including Christmas and Easter. So the 23rd Avenue Presbyterian Church is still there, and it's owned by one family who lives there. So there's a single family that lives in that huge church. But left to right, there's Annie Lowe, Edwin Lowe, Richard Lowe, Shirley Chin, Georgia Lung, and Gladys Lowe. So those are our family members that would actually go in and participate in some of the recitals. So there's Mary Van Deren and Amoy at City Park. And then there's Mary with Lucille Lung in front of the store. From the affiliation with the Presbyterian Church, two of our family members, Georgia Lung and Edwin Lowe, got college scholarships to Moody Bible Institute in Illinois. So again, how do you support a large and growing family? Multiple families live in the same house, provide room for boarders, which we already did. In Baker City, you saw the lodgers. They manage restaurants, stores, or they participated in gambling and prostitution. The first restaurant we had was the Shanghai restaurant. It was at 2130 Arapahoe. And if you look at the business card, it says noodles and chop suey, Oriental dishes. Again, there is soft drinks, tobacco, anything you probably want. So again, you look at the left picture is Hattie and Joe Lung. That's my dad. And then there's May, Bessie, and Joe Lung outside the Shanghai. Those are his two sisters. And then we have Hattie, Charlie, and Mabel Lung. To give you an idea, this is the 1930 census. This is how many people were living above that store and restaurant. So we have Charlie Lung, we have his wife and all of his kids, and then we have Harry Lowe and Mabel, and there's Pearl, and her name is Pearl Wing. So she's still married, and you have Clarence and Hattie also there. But you can also see what I think Catherine was alluding to when you start looking at these censuses. They start scratching out where they come from, where their parents are from. And again, this is totally wrong. When you start looking at it, it says that for even Charlie, that he's saying that he was born in China, and he wasn't. He was born in Auburn, Oregon. And then they don't even put the cities anymore. They just start writing USA on some of the census records. So again, this is just a photo of who was actually living on top of the Shanghai. And that's a lot of people. So they needed to move. And the first residence they had was at 2702 Franklin. It was a huge 3-story house. And then there's a 2141 Vine. But they also had the Yu Yi Cafe at the same time. So they had another business, and this was all day and night. Again, they had American food and Chinese food. And on the left is Joe Lung, that's my dad, and his dog, King Kong. And my dad had diphtheria, so he was in the hospital for a couple months. And instead of going back to Franklin, he actually went and lived with Amoy for a while. And he remembers that one of his tasks that he had to do is that they would put sawdust on the floor of the Yui Cafe at night, so it would collect all the liquid that was spilled. And one of his tasks that he had to do was actually go in and sweep up the sawdust and then get on his bike and head out to Whittier Elementary. In the center, you'll see Bessie and Amoy Lung and Gladys and Richard Lowe. Amoy had a brothel that was actually above the Yu Yi Cafe. And my dad also would actually have a memory of a redheaded woman, and he said she was so pretty. So he actually had some interactions with some women of the evening. But Pearl Lung is there also. And they were known at the Yu Yi Cafe for not only some of the night activities, but they had a blue plate special for 25 cents. And the good news is that that's my son by the Yu Yi Cafe, said the mural is still there. That building is still there, and they still have the mural of the Yu Yi on the side. It's a restaurant, but it's not owned by our family. So Amoy lived on 2019 Market. Again, she lived in Hop Alley. So the family visited Amoy. We entered through the front door, and the alley was where the entrances to the buildings were located. So the name of her establishment was Sing Chung and Company. It was a Chinese store. So again, on the left, that's just a celebration that we were having for somebody's birthday party. And you can see Amoy in front of her house. And then those are her two sons. There's Charlie and George. They're actually in front of the Market Street address. We had lots of family dinners and celebrations at Amoy's house. There were in the back way, when you were in the alley, you could go upstairs and there would be Chinese boarders that lived in attached buildings that she owned. But you could also go from room to room through a maze of hallways in the basement, and you never had to go outside. So she had boarders downstairs, and she also had boarders that were upstairs. But the destruction of Chinatown. In 1940, there was a big push to tear down the remaining buildings in Chinatown as part of the Denver urban renewal. The city justified it through the public health department. So again, it wasn't that they hated the Chinese. They just said that they were infested with rats, disease-ridden. It was a public nuisance. So again, several Chinese families, including the Lungs, still own property in the area. So here's the article that they were talking about. It's the once glamorous Hop Alley, where it housed 1800 Orientals in the early days, but you can actually see some of the names of the people that owned these buildings. So again, there's Chu Moon Look, there's Lily Look, and if you look at the Sanborn map, I wrote in where Amoy was living, and you could go outside and look straight down the street. Again, these were people's houses that they were just going to destroy under the public housing and a nuisance. To give you an idea of these ruffians, again, this is Chinatown. These are pictures of our families. So again, to me, it looks like people that are just trying to make a living. So they're feeding their families. It looks like they're having a party in the alleyway, looks like a birthday party, or there's a family that's playing a piano. So again, those are some of the looks and the chins that were actually with us in Chinatown. So that's what they destroyed. They took down all the houses except for a few. And one of them is 2015 Market. So in 1946, it was actually turned into the Cafe Post. You can see the sign there. And there's Amoy and Lucille that are standing and sitting outside of the 2019 Market. And this becomes really important for the next slide, is that it's the View House Restaurant. These are the only buildings from the original Chinatown that are still standing. And one of them is Amoy's house at 2019 Market. Again, we talked about how to support a large family. Now we're going to talk about the gambling and prostitution. So the Tongs, which is translated as the gathering place or hall. There are 3 Tongs in Denver, the Hopsing Tong, the Hipsing Tong, and the Bingkong Tong. We were the Bingkong Tong. Again, the membership to a Tong is tied to where your family roots are in China. The Tongs were founded in the United States to protect its members from anti-Chinese prejudice that was common in America in the 1880s and provided them with a community structure since they couldn't rely on the police or the court systems to resolve disputes. But the Tongs became involved in vice to fund some of their operations, including gambling, drug trafficking, and prostitution. So this is the grand opening of the Bingkong Tong. It is at 2015. It was in 1928, June 1928. And if you ever look at the architecture of this building, and you go to other cities that had Chinatowns, if the Tongs are still there, the buildings look very, very similar. So this was a multi-day event. There were Masons that all went to celebrate. There were parties everywhere. And Charlie Lung was the manager of the Mandarin Cafe at the time. And it was the designated restaurant for this multi-day celebration. So standing, you can see the delegates. There's the Salt Lake City, Wang Ying, Benson Lee from San Francisco, El Chufan from Portland, and Yi Tom from Sacramento. And when I was actually in Portland last year, I connected with a person from the Bingkong Tong, and unfortunately, all of their records were destroyed in a flood in their building. But seated is Harry Yao. He's the assistant secretary. An important person is Harry Lowe, president. There's Jimmy Chin, the interpreter, and Chin Ta is the secretary. And we have an actual ribbon that they're all wearing from the 1928 event. So here's the love story. Charlie has a daughter, Mabel Lung, who loved Gilbert Wu. but Charlie decided that it was important that she'd marry Harry Lowe. So in 1929, Harry Lowe, who's 38, and Mabel Lung get married. Again, they're also listed as white. But what's significant is that Harry is older than Charlie Lung. So Mabel married a man that was older than her own father. And this becomes really important for us. So in the Chinese, it's translated as the Bing Kong Tong, to commemorate a promotion or improvement of the Tong. The date, August 26th of the 18th year of the Republic, 1929. And after a year and after Harry Lowe marries Mabel, Charlie Lung is now the manager of the Bing Kong Tong. So this is an important figure. That is Harry Lowe, and he's in the front seat of the Bing Kong Tong. This is a meeting, and he's very important for our family. But what's also important is that Charlie would be talking about what is the Bing Kong Tong, and he would tell you to visualize that when you would walk into this Bing Kong Tong and you were a tired traveler, that we'd actually be able to go in and you might be able to go and meet people that are speaking your dialect. You would be able to go in and find out what's happening behind the bamboo curtain by Chinese newspapers that were there. You could also find out about who's hiring. Where do you want to go in and find jobs or a place to live? They also had people that they had short-term rentals that people could do actually at the building, but they could also hear the clacking of the mahjong tiles where people would be playing and gambling. So again, this was a home away from home, but it also included loyalty. You were loyal to your Tong. So again, paper sons or paper daughters, these are individuals born in China. They illegally immigrated to the U.S. by obtaining documents that indicated that they were blood relatives of Chinese people who were already U.S. legal citizens or residents. So the earthquake in San Francisco, they lost all the paperwork in 1906. So again, with proper official looking documentation, an applicant could claim to be a merchant, teacher, professional, family member of a legal resident to gain admission to the U.S. This became the Who is the Harry Lowe? And that has been one thing that we've been trying to find out. So again, the Lungs were ABCs. They were American-born Chinese, but they married FOBs, which is fresh off the boats. And there was a clear distinction between these different types of people. Next page. So Harry Lowe, for my whole life, I've always heard him referred to as Big Harry. And he died before I was born. And I would look at pictures and I would say, why do they call him Big Harry? He doesn't look very big. And my dad would say, he's important. He was an important person. So again, Mabel and Harry had 4 children, Gladys, Richard, Edwin, and Annie. And when they were with Harry, the women had beautiful clothes. The men had wonderful cars, the latest. They lived in huge houses. And it was important for Harry because the family flourished underneath Harry Lowe. So Big Harry was important for our family. But with power comes a lot of pressure and responsibility. So again, there was issues with Harry later on. Harry died in 1942 at 55 years. So the last 2 years of his life, he was an inmate at the Colorado State Insane Asylum. That's what it was called back then. So for 2 years, he was there in 1940 all the way until he died in 1942. And that is his eldest son, Richard Lowe, who is a decorated World War II veteran. But the family goes on. So we had gambling. And Charlie Lung ran the Chinese lottery. So again, these are 5-inch square papers with 80 characters. For $1, you'd buy 10 numbers. And Charlie had his family pick up the tickets and money from different businesses and people on their bikes and bring them to the gambling halls. And gambling halls for Charlie could either be the residences or any of our businesses. So up at the top is my dad on his bike. Below him is Eugene on his bike, and Richard Lowe would also have to ride the bike. And I have the punch that actually Charlie used for actually punching out the numbers. But for, again, the drawing for the 10 numbers, if you drew all 10 numbers, you could win $3,000, which is a lot of money. So again, Charlie deducted 15% of the winnings. But there's always issues when you're gambling. So in June 1942, 500,000 lottery tickets were seized. And again, this was when they were living at 2702 Franklin, and Lucille and Charlie were arrested. And the tickets bore the name of the Young Tong Company. And again, they paid the fines and they continued gambling. So the family moved. The family home on 2702 Franklin is torn down to expand Manual High School, and now they're moving to 2141 Vine. In the meantime, World War II started. And this was important for the Lung family. So after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, the Lung family felt strongly that they needed to enlist in the military to show their support and patriotism. So again, China became an ally with the U.S. in 1943, and the Magnuson Act was repealed, and the Chinese could become U.S. citizens, which is going to be important. During World War II, Chinese, again, there was a lot of anti-Asian sentiment. They wanted to make a clear distinction between the Japanese and the Chinese. So the Chinese wore pins that both the U.S. flag and the Chinese flag, and they showed victory. And the other had pins that said, "I am Chinese, not Japanese." So again, here's an article in 1941. The Chinese don't take chances on being mistaken for Japs. So again, this is Hazel Chin, her classmates at East High School, and Frankie Coy is there. They wanted to make sure by designing this pin, and those are two of my dad's pins that he has. But Frankie Coy he was on the streetcar, and he said that people were giving him terrible looks. So again, he wrote on chalk, says, "Don't shoot, I'm a Chinaman." So again, there was a clear distinction, and our family did not take public transportation, and they were very cautious about going into stores and kind of staying together. This was a hard time for all Asians during World War II. So the Lung military pictures, again, on the left, there's Amoy, my dad, and Mabel. Then there's a picture of my dad who looks really young. But you'll see the article of May and Bessie. And this is when the Denver Bears was our baseball team, and they did an actual exhibition game. And all the proceeds from that game went to support the China Relief Fund. And then on the end is Eugene and, of course, Bessie and May. So when the family returned from the war, several used the GI Bill to either pay for college or to buy their first homes. So there was a whole lot of Lungs after the war at 2141 Vine. So Charlie and Lucille lived on the first floor. My parents, Joe and Gloria, and my sister lived in the basement. Harry, Dorothy, Sharon, and Darrow lived on the second floor. Then the oldest brother, Eugene, Helen, Kenny, and Albert lived on the second floor. And of course, Georgia, who's the baby, and Pearl Lung. So Pearl's back with the family. They're on the second floor. So citizenship. Again, our Lucille Lung was a FOB. She was fresh off the boat. So again, in 1961, she gets an article in the newspaper of why I wanted to be an American. So after 40 years in the United States, she now has become a citizen, and she says it's so important because she's going to have relatives in the Orient whom she might want to visit. And it's more important because she can return home to 2141 Vine. I can go any place. She said she and her husband, Charlie, used to be in the restaurant business, and she's been busy raising her 7 children, all born in Denver, which isn't quite true since we know some were born in China. But Georgia is the one that's the U.S. Air Force and recently returned from duty in Japan. They lived there 8 years, and he's a native of Oregon. And of course, she's a native of China. And we were very proud to have, and she was also really proud to be an American citizen. In 1960, Amoy sells the Market House, and she moves in to the family home. But in April, you see her in her fur coat. She's outside in 1961 with the rest of the family. So there's Lucille and Charlie, her son. And then behind her is Mabel. And Gladys is Mabel's firstborn child. but she continued gardening. So her and Lucille had a huge garden in the back of the Vine House, and they would have bok choy, they'd have their snow peas and bitter melon. But in 1962, we would still go and visit at Vine, but now she was up in her bed most of the time. But when you looked at it, she still had pictures all along her wall. There's Sam, there's George, there's a picture of her, there's Pearl, and when you look down the further, there was Charlie. Right there is Bessie. So again, Amoy was 81 years old when I was born. She died in 1962 when I was 10. She did not have an easy life, and throughout her whole life, she supported and cared for the family. She was a strong woman. She was soft-spoken, but when she talked, everyone listened. She never let circumstances prevent her success as a mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. She owned businesses and real estate during a time when it was uncommon for a woman. She was a trailblazer. But I also remember that Amoy rolled her own cigarettes. So she'd always have a Prince Albert can of tobacco. And I remember when she would roll her cigarettes and then she'd strike a kitchen match and smoke. And I would look and I would say, gosh, I can hardly wait till I'm old enough so I can smoke. And she also had these jade combs, and she would comb out her hair and then she'd braid it and then she'd put it up. And I have the jade combs that she used on her hair. So American Dream. Our ancestors worked in restaurants, gambling halls, and other service industry jobs so future generations would have a better life. The Lungs, along with the other Chinese Americans, thrived and succeeded in Denver. Again, Chinatown did not disappear after the 1880 anti-Chinese riot, as reported by historians, but the Lung story conveys a story of hope, resilience, and to document the true history of the Chinese in the United States. But before we go into questions, again, I want to thank Catherine Dickson and Chelsea Rose, who reached out years ago, and it was years ago, to ask me if I had relatives that lived in Auburn, Oregon. Again, using their archaeological skills to find possible evidence of Sam and Amoy Lung in Auburn, it's been an amazing journey. Again, the scientific evidence validates our family stories. Both women have generously provided opportunities for me to share Amoy's story, and I hope that we will have opportunities to collaborate again in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. We were just amazed by the breadth of your family story and all the documentation that you had. I was so impressed. We want to get started with some questions, and I hope it's not too loud. I think that there's like a children's birthday party happening in the room behind me, so please let me know if it's too loud. But we want to take some questions from our audience today. And so just a reminder, you can use the Q&A section or the chat. And you're getting a lot of lovely positive notes in the chat section. And I might just kick off the Q&A with a few questions that we received. Bear with me for 1 minute. Linda, this is on topic of how incredible your research is and all of the amazing documentation that you were able to show us today. We're wondering if you can speak to your process for finding all the documents and putting the story together. We can tell it's oral history, but then you also have such incredible visual culture references as well as genealogy. So if you could just speak to your process a bit, it was wonderful.
Again, starting the process, have been interested to try to go in and find our family history. So going through, I think what initially was to go through and find old documents that we had and old photos. And I think it's the old photos that suddenly you start asking about, who's this or where are they at? And so that was one of the things of the process of actually just going through and sorting and then collecting and gathering stories. And we had family reunions, and we would actually go in and ask our elders again questions. But we had some of our elders that said, it's nobody's business, nobody wants to hear, don't share any of the information, and just let it go, which was too bad because we didn't press it. And again, we were younger then. And so it was like, well, if they don't want to talk about it. But then we did have some that were wonderful, that opened up and actually let us go through all the photos, and they were interested also. And going in and looking at and trying to find. But I think finding documents, and I have to tell you that Catherine has been so wonderful, because at first, when I initially went through the presentation, I put every single document, and she said, Linda, you don't have to convince us. We believe you. But I would give her every single document, and she would say, you don't need this. We don't need to see every single tally, every single birth certificate or anything. So it's good to know that. But again, it's that documentation that you hear stories throughout when you're growing up, and then you have to go in and start investigating them and seeing, is this really true? Or is this just a story? And there's always a little bit of truth in some of the myths that have been passed down in generations.
Yeah. I love that. It's a great model for other folks that are, maintaining the legacies of their family. It's wonderful that we have it recorded and that the folks here today can see too.
So one of the questions was, how long did this entire process take for you, Linda, from when you first were interested in the people in the pictures?
Well, I think that our family has always been good collectors of photos and everything, and we've talked about it for years, but I would say probably in the last 7 years of sitting down and really going through old microfiche, which is just so painful, to actually go in and start finding some of the documentation that can support some of the photos, and really going through some of the assessors and trying to find out where did they actually live and where did they actually own property.
Yeah.
And I think one of the amazing things is that I found in Amoy's old documents is that she still had a money order from the 1940s from a lady from Pocatello, Idaho, who was renting that house. And so when my son and I were driving through Pocatello, I said, we should see if we can cash this. Just for $20.
But they have to account for inflation and everything, so you should get more.
So Tricia comments that she appreciates the wonderful research and that she herself lived in Denver in the 70s. So it was fun to hear you mentioning many of the street names that she remembers.
Wonderful.
Yeah, there are so many wonderful comments in the chat. We'll have to make sure and catch them all. Thanking you for your research and presentation.
So Megan is asking, why do you think some of your relatives say they were born in China when in fact they were born in the United States?
I think that was just I think a misstep, because I think that the idea is that when the census and people came for the census, I think that there was in the 1950 census, when Lucille answered the door and the census worker came in. Well, my mother and my cousin Heather's mother are German, and Eugene's wife was Hispanic. And Lucille wrote in the 1950 census that everybody in the house was Chinese. So again, I'm not sure that some of the census records or some of the documentation, I think it's who was doing the recording.
I was just going to say, maybe the census taker just sort of made a huge general assumption and just wrote that in.
I think that's quite possible, especially with, hopefully things got better later, but I think then they approached a household of a totally different cultural background. They just started to fill things in based on what they assumed. So I would not be surprised if Amoy did not say she was born in China. She said she was born in Oregon, but they wrote down China anyway.
Good point.
Yeah. Trying to catch up on the chat for questions. It looks like Suen Ho asks, are the names mentioned, are any of the names mentioned, I think, buried in Oregon? I think you said in the Baker City, was it the Baker City Cemetery? there was an image of that. I'm not,
Yes, but
yeah.
so Catherine, is there a burial ground in Auburn?
So, as some people know, it was a cultural tradition to try to return remains back to China. And as Linda reminded me, that was more so for the males. And so Linda's great grandmother, she had record of her dying in Auburn. And so she may have been buried in the Auburn cemetery. We don't know where Chinese people were buried. There is a cemetery there still. There's no particular marker. One of the books that Linda referenced has a long description of a burial of a funeral of a Chinese woman. I think she was cremated. So there probably are more people than we know about, but we don't have any actual headstones for any of Linda's family in Oregon.
So I have a question. There's something that you brought up, which I found very interesting. Many generations now that were born in the U.S. Why do you think that so many of your ancestors did marry or went back to China to get wives rather than trying to marry locally or other American-born Chinese women?
Well, in Denver, I think most of them, like my dad would say, is that he would make a reference and he said, "Why would I not marry a Chinese woman to be like kissing my sisters?" So again, he actually went in and made sure that he always dated whites. It was white women, and he married a white woman.
And a lot of your grandparents or your great uncles
Yes.
did go back to China to get white.
Yes. But even in when I was growing up, so in high school, we were told that if you want to go and marry a Chinese boy, then you need to go to college in California because there's a good selection.
Oh.
So I think that does, that both of those answers get to, the population. And so the population of Chinese coming to the United States in the 1860s and, all through the anti-immigrant legislation, it was really, there were so many more men than there were women. So I think that's partly that. And then we have Linda's Aunt Pearl, who was she was an independent-minded woman who spoke her mind, and that maybe was not what a lot of Chinese-born men were looking for. And so if you were raised traditional, you might not so much want what we think of as a typical American woman.
Yes.
Well, and I know I'm not catching up with all of the like incredible notes of gratitude, and I'll try to at least get you a copy of that. But I did want to note Kim Wong says, as a Lung family member who happened to grow up in Portland, it was always odd to me to hear about an Oregon connection. It's so great to finally see how it connects because you really do lay it out so well. So that's wonderful. And then a quick follow-up question to kind of process. Janice Choi Weber asks, what are your ideas on how to share your research with extended family so all of your work may be continued with descendants who want to add to your family story? Which is a great question.
It is. And I have done some presentations actually to some of the family. And we have some interested younger folks that I think will continue with wanting to know more about our family. But it's generational, and I think it's interesting to see that there's younger generations that are now saying, boy, I want to know about all of that versus, boy, just let it die. So we're hoping.
Well, and also it was interesting to hear that some of the elders in your family were very willing to share the information and others not. I would bet that is something that other families find to be the case as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Let's see here.
There's a comment from Andrew Pearson, who says that was great. Thank you, Catherine, for connecting the archaeological work to the present. And thank you, Linda, for sharing your family's story together. It really adds a meaningful layer to our understanding of the Chinese experience in Auburn, Oregon, and the lives connected to that history.
And then I think one more question. Oops, I accidentally turned off. No, I've got it on again. Sorry. Was about, so to Catherine, to have this wealth of knowledge about the family members that were, kind of on and near the site that you'll be looking at this summer. Does that change anything about your process, add anything to it? It's interesting because it seems like sometimes with an archaeologist or with an archaeology dig, you don't always have such a rich history to work from. Just curious how that incredible resource might change how the work is done or what the results are, if it does.
Yeah, it's really unusual, and so that's why we archaeologists are so excited to have the lineal descendant. So in terms of like the actual work, I think part of it is when deciding where this summer to do excavations within Auburn, Linda's family store and home makes the most sense because there are living people who care about it in a different way. And so I think that's helped us pick a spot. I don't think it'll change the methodology. From that book, we have a little bit of description of what was going on there. One of the things I'd be really interested in is apparently there were 2 stores in Auburn that were across the street from each other during the era where it was a majority Chinese town. And one of them, Linda's family, the Lung store, was more Americanized, and the other was kind of where you went to smoke your opium and gamble and do various other things. And so I think doing an excavation where we could compare the material culture of those 2 places would be super interesting. But it all depends what exactly we can find and those sorts of things. So hopefully that answered your question.
Oh yeah, that does. That's wonderful. It does seem like it's kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity to have these two, the site available and the rich family history. So,
and it's been also interesting because what Catherine, she would email me and she'd say, we think we found a porcelain doll's face. And I'd be like, I mean, it was like pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Exciting.
Because you could see family members like possibly holding it or yeah. It's wonderful. So many positive words of gratitude for both of you. Both Demay, thank you for sharing this story. So much history isn't told about Chinese American history. And then Dale, thank you for documenting a fascinating story that's so familiar to many of us with Chinese pioneer heritage. And I hope I didn't miss anyone. I wanted to make sure and kind of pepper those notes of thanks into the question and answer.
I just have one quick question. Linda, has there any been attempt to try to connect with the family village back in China?
We're trying to figure out our village. And that has been one of the hard things, is to be able to go back. We would love to be able to go in and do the connections and see what there is back in the village, but we haven't. So that's one of the things that we're working on. And Chelsea has gotten a good article where I've been trying to go in and figure out, because as you all know, there's so many translations for different family names.
Yeah.
And the surname that they used.
And then it looks like we have another question in the chat from Fran Jensen. It says, what is the family story about the girl left on a doorstep? This is Kim's mom.
Oh, left on a doorstep. I'm not sure about that.
Is that perhaps part of the Oregon side of the family, or?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's maybe a topic to think about, as that's one of the ways in which this presentation could help, fill in the gaps as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I just want to make sure there are no more questions because we are coming up to our time, and want to make sure we say thanks to our incredible presenters. But Fran, if you want to follow up with anything, let us know, and we can always send that along to everyone. All right. I think we're actually right on time. It's a good thing that we saved more space for the presentation because it was incredible, truly epic. And I just want to give a big Portland Chinatown Museum thank you to our presenters, Catherine and Linda, and of course, the Oregon Chinese Diaspora Project. Also, our wonderful audience for joining us today. If you'd like to rewatch this program or share it with others, a recording will be made available on our YouTube and Vimeo pages by next week. And we'll make sure, Linda and Catherine, that you get the comments as well. Just a reminder that today's event is the 5th presentation in our 6-part series. And our next presentation will be our final presentation of this round. It will be in March, entitled Alt House Archaeologies, Early Chinese Miners in Southern Oregon. And the presenter for that will be Jocelyn Lee. We'll look at the archaeological story at Alt House that sheds light on how Chinese miners moved across the Oregon landscape as they pursued economic opportunities. Just want to say lots more words of gratitude in the chat for both of you. And I want to say thank you one more time for your presentations, and to everyone who attended. We look forward to seeing you at the next one. And have a happy Valentine's Day.
And Lunar New Year.
Yeah. And yeah, oh my goodness, I should actually plug our Lunar New Year parade that's coming up on March 7th. We hope to see you all at that as well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.